Who's actually going to get the most out of a 24-track analog-to-digital mixer? And who would be better off putting their money into a simpler interface? If you're sitting at a desk wondering whether the Tascam Model 24 is the right tool for your home studio, your live-gig rig, or maybe both, that's exactly the hesitation I felt before I dug into the specs, skimmed a few forum threads, and tried to picture it in real-world setups. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. The core question isn't just, does it record 24 tracks, but does it make my workflow smoother, or does it add another layer of complexity you'll never use? Let's break it down. First off, the Model 24 sits at the intersection of two worlds that many musicians straddle: the analog mixing console and the digital multitrack recorder. That hybrid identity is both its biggest selling point and the source of most buyer confusion. If you've ever tried to sync a separate analog board with a DAW, you know the pain of juggling cables, clock settings, and latency quirks. The Model 24 promises to dissolve that friction by giving you a full 24-track recorder built right into the mixer, plus a USB audio interface that talks directly to your computer. In practice, that means you can run a live band through the board, hit record, and later pull the individual tracks into Pro Tools or Ableton without ripping a bunch of stems off a separate recorder. So who should consider pulling the trigger? The sweet spot is the semi-professional musician who already owns a handful of mics, a couple of outboard compressors, and maybe a small PA for gigs. Imagine a folk rock trio that books local venues, records their rehearsals, and occasionally releases EPs. With the Model 24, they can plug their vocal mics, DI boxes for acoustic guitars, and a stereo line from a keyboard into the 16-DIN branded preamps, set the EQ on the fly, and hit record, while the sound engineer is still mixing the house monitors. Because the console has dedicated EQ and auxiliary knobs for each channel, there's no need to dive into deep menus to tweak tone during a take. When the show wraps, the engineer can press play, cue any track, and even bounce the whole session straight to the computer via the USB link. That workflow mix, record, edit happens in a single piece of hardware, which saves both time and desk space. On the flip side, if you're a bedroom producer whose entire setup lives inside a laptop and a pair of headphones, the Model 24 is likely overkill. Those users typically benefit from a compact audio interface with 2 or 4 inputs, not a full-size rack that weighs a few pounds and demands a power outlet. The learning curve of managing 24 channels, routing AUX sends, and dealing with the built-in recorder can feel like extra baggage when you only need to lay down a vocal and a synth line. In that scenario, you'd spend more on the console than you'd actually use, and you might end up with a half-empty rack and a pile of unused cables. Let's talk about the practical strengths that become evident once you plug it in. The 16 Tascam mic preamps are the first thing most users notice. They have a reputation for low noise and a decent amount of headroom, which means you can run dynamic mics for drums or ribbon mics for guitars without constantly worrying about clipping. In a live sound context, that translates to cleaner drum room mics and more usable snare tracks later on. The EQ sections are classic semi-parametric designs. You get a sweepable mid, a high shelf, and a low cut, all accessible without hunting through digital menus. For someone who likes to dial in tone on the fly, say, boosting the presence on a lead vocal while pulling down the low end on a bass amp, the tactile knobs feel natural and fast. Another hidden advantage is the ability to record directly to an internal SD card at 24-bit/48 kHz. For touring bands, that means you can capture every show without a laptop, then simply swap cards and transfer the files later. I've seen small crews load the Model 24 into a van, run the house mix, and walk away with a full multi-track session that they can mix at a later date. The fact that the recordings are already time-stamped and organized by channel cuts down on post-production grunt work. Now, the weaknesses. Because the console merges analog and digital domains, you're still dealing with the latency that comes from any USB audio interface. In most DAW setups, the latency is low enough for overdubbing. But if you're trying to use the Model 24 as a real-time monitor for a live band while also feeding the DAW, you may notice a slight delay that can be distracting for performers. The console's USB implementation is solid, but it's not a dedicated Thunderbolt interface, so you're limited to the bandwidth of a standard USB 2.0 port. For most 24-track projects, that's fine, but heavy multi-track sessions with high-resolution plugins could feel a pinch. Another practical consideration is the learning curve around routing. The Model 24 offers multiple stereo line